Despite the fact that the civil rights movement ended almost 50 years ago, its legacy is still evident today. Its leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, are renowned for their pivotal role in ending the institutional racism and segregation that had plagued the nation for so long. However, while it appears that they were successful in their goal, today, in 2016, issues involving race are at the forefront of national attention. While the civil rights movement officially began in 1954, its roots and causes go back much further. Following the end of the Civil War, African Americans were emancipated from slavery, and it initially appeared as if racial equality under the Constitution has been achieved. Throughout the Reconstruction era in the South, blacks made use of their newfound rights to take part in politics, either through voting or by running and getting elected into political office. However, despite all the advances made directly after the Civil War, when Reconstruction ended, African Americans found themselves disenfranchised once again. By 1870s, every southern state had been readmitted to the Union. Conservative whites began to slowly take back control of their state governments. Angered and scared by the idea of black-run government, they did everything in their power to prevent just that. Acts of violence and terrorism were commonly used in order to intimidate black leaders. Slavery was not legally over, but blacks were still being discriminated against in all aspects of life. Over the course of nearly a century, this trend of disenfranchisement continued through the use of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and more intimidation. However, this all changed in 1954 when a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. Rosa Parks' actions sparked the beginning of the civil rights movements, straight up, which would gradually gain momentum and eventually transform the entire nation. Following the success of the Montgomery bus boycotts, which thousands of black commuters refused to ride city buses for 381 days until they were desegregated, many African Americans began to look forward towards Martin Luther King Jr. for leadership. People were attracted to his advocacy for nonviolent protests, as well as his preaching of Christian values and brotherhood. MLK's passion and popularity propelled him to the forefront of the movement, and soon he became its most influential leader. Martin Luther King's leadership led to mass protests such as the Birmingham Campaign in 1963. During the same campaign, King was arrested and wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. The letter detailed the injustice faced by African Americans on a daily basis and justified both the movement as a whole and Dr. King's strategy of nonviolent protesting. A few months after the Birmingham campaign, two civil rights leaders, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, organized the Monumental March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The event was made possible through the cooperation between a multitude of civil rights, religious, and labor organizations. Taking place over the course of 2 days in August, it was attended over by 250,000 people. On the second day of the rally, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech and called for a universal end to racism and segregation. Both his speech and the march are considered monumental moments for the movement. Around the time of the march, President John F. Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Bill to Congress. It included provisionals to outlaw discrimination in public places, provided greater protection for black voters, and banned racial discrimination regarding employment. Kennedy was assassinated while the bill was still in Congress, but his successor, President Johnson, worked hard to ensure its survival. Despite attempts to kill the bill by Southern Democrats through filibusters, it was passed by both houses and was signed into law by Johnson on July 2, 1964. About 1 year later, Johnson also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. It enforced the voting rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendment by prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. Through banning poll taxes and other methods employed by Southern states to prevent blacks from voting, it finally allowed African Americans to enjoy the constitutional right that had been denied since Reconstruction. Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement was created by three women after the shooting of Trayvon Martin. Many African Americans were upset by the fact that Zimmerman was not convicted and thus rallied behind Black Lives Matter for the first organized equal rights movement since the Civil Rights Movement led by MLK and Malcolm X. Black Lives Matter has exploded into a nationwide campaign. The Black Lives Matter campaign followed in the footsteps of Malcolm X, who preached equality by violence, leading to many riots, while MLK's nonviolent method was the most successful during the 1950s. Black Lives Matter had a large influence in the Ferguson and Baltimore riots. Social media played a large role in the Black Lives Matter movement gaining national support. While Black Lives Matter was created after the death of Trayvon Martin, it was not until the Ferguson riots that it became very popular on social media. Similar to the Civil Rights Movement, there was an opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement. Some people believe that the Black Lives Matter movement was unwarranted as racism and has already been dealt with via the Civil Rights Movement. Some people believe that the Black Lives Matter movement was unwarranted as racism that had already been dealt with via the Civil Rights Movement. Part of the Black Lives Matter movement was to shed light to the fact that racism is still a prevalent issue in America. The Black Lives Matter movement's main focus was police brutality against African Americans. Black Lives Matter has become a national-wide movement, and one of the most frequent terms on social media is hashtag Black Lives Matter. The main cause of the movement, the police shooting of African Americans, has been a very controversial topic. The whole movement is based on them, but many feel that the police officers were not acting based on racial discrimination. Rather, it was the people who caused the officers to act with violence. This has hurt the movement greatly, as it is hard for them to continue to get more support, as many believe that race is an issue for the past and that these shootings have nothing to do with race. Another issue has been their lack of leadership. They have had no organized events or protests like the Civil Rights Movement, which has led to the reactions like Ferguson and Baltimore rioting. On top of that, their protesters have gotten very violent and destructive, which is hurting their message. The movement has succeeded in bringing more awareness to racial issues, particularly those involving the police. But with no real goals, it is hard for the movement to achieve anything substantial. Both movements were the result of racism towards African Americans. The Civil Rights Movement was mainly in response to segregation, while the Black Lives Matter movement was in response to police brutality of African Americans. In the Civil Rights Movement, there was a clear institutional racism. Separate but equal was not even close to being equal. However, with the Black Lives Matter, it is less clear of whether or not all of the incidents are racist. As a result of this, the Civil Rights Movement had a clear goal which allowed for the success like the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. With the Black Lives Matter movement, their idea is the same, but with no clear goal and less defined racism. It will be tough for them to share the same success as the Civil Rights Movement. Organized movements. Ferguson, the unofficial start of Black Lives Matter. Riots started over the killing of Michael Brown, an African-American teenager who was unarmed. When the jury found Darren Wilson, the white cop who shot Brown, to be innocent, it caused even more anger within the community. While this brought the Black Lives Matter into national perspective, it had no real positive outcome, and many felt the protests were out of line and caused more damage than good. Baltimore. Baltimore started as a result of the death of Freddie Gray. Less than a week after his arrest, the protesting began. It started with a few hundred outside of the police station and then turned into a citywide riot. The riots became very violent, resulting in 6 injured cops and over 200 arrests. 6 officers were put on trial for their role in the death of Freddie Gray, and the officer, Edward Nero, was being accused of second-degree murder. At the end, all 6 were found innocent. This hurt the Black Lives Matter movement as they saw that not even the law was on their side. This hurt the Black Lives Matter movement and overall created a bad reputation. This hurt the Black Lives Matter movement and overall created a bad reputation. Montgomery. Rosa Parks started this movement in 1955 by refusing to change seats on the bus for a white person. This kicked off a year-long protest in which blacks did not ride the buses, and since they were the main passengers, it greatly hurt the industry. This protest resulted in a Supreme Court ruling that segregation of public buses was unconstitutional. The crowd was both white and black, and the march ended with MLK giving his famous I Have a Dream speech. This speech helped the civil rights movement gain even more momentum, and the whole nation was aware of the march. This march was very successful and helped lead to the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Opposition faced by the movements. The civil rights movement faced a large and violent opposition because America was divided on the race issue. Some people believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is unnecessary, but no real action against the movement has been taken place. The opposition for the civil rights movement was so great that they had the leader, MLK, killed. The civil rights movement took time and a lot of effort to grow into a nationwide effort, especially in comparison with the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement became a nationwide movement after the Ferguson riots thanks to social media, especially the phrase #BlackLivesMatter. Both movements' major events were the result of what they believed to be racial inequality. However, they went about it in two different ways. The civil rights movement, led by MLK, planned out their protests and did it non-violently, which led to much success. The Black Lives Matter movement had no leadership, so their protests turned violent and without a main goal did not see as much success. The civil rights movement can be classified as a success. They achieved most of the goals that they set and made many positive changes for African Americans. That is not to say things were perfect, but with the new legislation and national recognition, African Americans had more rights than they ever did, and all major forms of racism like slavery and segregation were outlawed. The Black Lives Matter movement, coming after the civil rights, is trying to deal with different issues that are now involving African Americans. The civil rights movement had clear-cut goals, making African American lives better by getting rid of segregation and other racist institutions that were plaguing their race. On the other hand, the Black Lives Matter movement does not have clear goals. It is similar in that they both are trying to help African Americans, but without clear-cut goals, it will be hard for the Black Lives Matter movement to see as much success as its predecessor. Their ideas are based on the fact that all of the police shootings have been out of racism and the men killed are not at fault. Many people feel this is not the case and that this issue is being blown out of proportion, which has hurt the movement. Unlike the civil rights movement, no new legislation have been passed as the result of their actions, thus making the movement nowhere near as successful as the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement had prominent leaders who helped guide the movement. Martin Luther King, who is the most famous, preached protests through nonviolence, which is why the movement had such a positive impact. The other leader was Malcolm X, who managed to help gain support for the movement, but failed in accomplishing any real legal changes. This was due to his violent methods, which were oftentimes only successful in causing more issues and unnecessary bloodshed. The Black Lives Matter movement lacks a true leader, which is why all their protests have only been successful at bringing racial issues to national attention. Also, the Black Lives Matter movement is seemingly following in the footsteps of Malcolm X through their violent protests in both Ferguson and Baltimore. Again, just like Malcolm X, these tactics help shed light on the issues at hand but make no real strides towards fixing them.